Welcome, Barry Schwartz, to The Possibility of Business, episode number two. I'm very excited to talk to you today about your long career, a lot of your writing, a lot of your thinking, some of which I stumbled across um, about 6 or 7 years ago during COVID, as I was doing a deep dive into the history of economics and where it intersected with psychology and sociology and business. And I stumbled across your book, which had done a lot of that thinking 40 years earlier.
Yeah,
Let me introduce you for briefly, and then we'll just jump into a little bit about how you got to write that book, and then what you've been thinking about, and what you're thinking about possibly writing in the near future. Um, so, your history, if I have this right, you started at Swarthmore in the 70s. Is that right?
71.
71, yeah. And, in that time focused on psychology. You were trained as a psychologist, got into some social psychology, started getting into the intersection between that and economics, and have since written, is it 8 books at this point?
Something like that.
Something about 8 books, okay. The book I stumbled across was your second book. Extremely impressed with. It was called, The Battle for Human Nature, and, I'd love to maybe, we could probably go 1,000 different directions and speak for hours, but obviously we don't have that kind of time. And so I'd love to just dig in and have you tell us how you arrived at writing The Battle for Human Nature. You're a psychologist. It sounds like you took some time. You and I had a brief chat prior to this, and you took some time to go do some studying at Harvard, and you pulled together a lot of strands of thinking of different social sciences to come up with what I thought was a pretty expansive view of human nature and some of the limitations of the rather narrow, shall we say, social science disciplines. And you had some questions about that. So maybe you could just take us through how you ended up studying that.
Sure, I'm delighted. I mean, it's sort of a trip down memory lane for me, but, that book essentially shaped the rest of my career. I'll step back even a little. My training in psychology was in the framework, that was established by B.F. Skinner, who at the time in the 50s and 60s was the giant in academic psychology. And he's known nowadays, probably mostly historically, if at all, but he was the father of what's called behaviorism. And his framework was that if you want to understand behavior, you need to understand the contingencies of reward and punishment. Everything that organisms do, they do because they have had positive consequences in the past. And if they've had negative consequences in the past, they stop doing them. So the environment shapes us in a particular direction by rewarding us for the things it wants us to do and punishing us for the things it doesn't want us to do. So that was the framework I was trained in. And I was very dubious about that, not that it wasn't a true picture, but that it wasn't a true picture of everything there was to know about human beings. And Skinner thought not only is this true, but this is all you need. If you understand this, you understand everything. And that struck me as completely distorted picture of my own life and the lives of people I knew. So anyway, that was my expertise. I taught at a place called Swarthmore College, which is a liberal arts college where the premium is placed on being a generalist, not a specialist. There are no graduate students. There's nobody working to get a PhD. So you're talking to 18 to 21-year-olds, and my job, I thought, was to help them see why the stuff that I knew was stuff they should care about. And the way to do that is not to burrow deeper and deeper and deeper into the kind of research that Skinnerians did, but instead to tell a story about how it explains things in everyday life or might explain things in everyday life. So I tried to teach expansively because I thought that was what the students wanted. And at a place like Swarthmore, that's encouraged. At a major university, nobody does that these days, and nobody did it back then either. You you learn more and more about less and less. That's the general story of academic research. Um, so anyway, I had a sabbatical and I went to Harvard to study for the year because I had seen a potential connection between economics on the one hand, evolutionary biology on the other hand, and Skinnerian behaviorism on the third hand. And I didn't know, I'd never taken an economics course. I didn't know much about evolutionary biology. So the idea was to learn those disciplines so that when I came back, I could teach a course that talked about the relation between economics, this branch of biology, and this branch of psychology. So that's what I did. I studied with people in economics, and a historian of science taught me a course in the sort of Darwinian theory. And I had
And
no
can I ask you, Barry, in that moment before you got there and you saw this connection, how would you have framed that connection you saw?
great. So each of those disciplines has a theory, an implicit theory about what human nature is. For economics, it's all about self-interest, and the way people operate is as rational calculators of their self-interest. So being rational, being smart, using your mind is central to economics, but the what moves you, what gets you out of bed is how can I make the coming day profitable? And usually profitable means literally, materially profitable. So the economic rationality, maximizing utility, maximizing returns is at the heart of the economist theory about human nature. You want to understand what somebody did in the world, look at the incentive structure. That'll tell you everything. Now, that's a lot like Skinner, but the difference is that Skinner thought that was all done mechanically, and you could see it in pigeons and rats who didn't have this incredible intellectual power. But it was the same thing. If you want to understand what an organism does, look at the incentives. So for economists, this was rational calculation, and for Skinner, it was this sort of automatic process. But the engine was the same engine, and I saw that connection. Um, and I wanted to develop it since, economics is the language of modern society in the social sciences. So showing that this labs research in psychology actually is talking in the same language seemed to me to be would be an insight for students. Evolutionary biology is also in its way about incentives, but it thinks these incentives are neither the product of rational calculation nor the product of rewards and punishments in the life history of an organism, but instead they are the products of reward and punishment at the level of the gene. A particular pattern of behavior appears, it increases your reproductive success, it will spread through subsequent generations. If it impairs your reproductive success, it will not get past the subsequent generations. So for the evolutionary biologist, the coin of the realm is not material outcomes, it is offspring.
Mm,
That's the coin of the realm. But it's the same sort of relentless mechanical, the environment selects traits that will make you more successful at reproducing going forward. And there's a sort of mechanistic logic to it from the point of view of evolutionary biology.
as you're going in, are you do you have a pretty good sense that that connective tissue is creating kind of a flattening of the understanding and and
Yes.
the way that humans are
Yeah,
thinking?
what I believed is that all of these views are true, but they are not nearly as general as the people who propound these views think. That they explain a piece of what makes human beings and a piece of what makes the societies that human beings operate in, but that piece isn't everything. That piece isn't every piece. And so what I had in mind was to develop a course where you would, sort of, reveal assumptions about what people are and what people care about that essentially put blinders on the people in these disciplines, and so what they focus on is all they can see, and the result is a very incomplete and sometimes distorted picture of what human nature really is. That was the plan.
And can I pause you there? What I'm realizing is we didn't share years. This is 1985, 86,
No, 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 it was 1981.
81.
I've been teaching at Swarthmore for a decade.
Okay.
Um, and anyway, so again, I
So
had
this
no
is j
intention
and
of
this is right right as Reaganomics is getting it's in its nascency. I mean, these really deep kind of neoliberal ways of thinking about our business world haven't really taken hold yet. So you're in many ways kind of out in front of that wave.
well, out in front or behind, this was the way the things I was focusing on were things that people might have focused on right after the Depression. But what happened, after we recovered from the Depression and the Second World War ended, there was this shift that occurred gradually in people's outlook and the sort of radical union organizing driven concern about the common man sort of went disappeared in a puff of smoke,
Yeah.
slowly but surely. And you're right, the apotheosis of this was Reagan. Although I think, and we discussed this in the past, that the real hammer blow was not Reagan because his ideology was on his sleeve. It was it was Clinton and Tony Blair and quote neoliberalism, which made it less ideological and more, well, this is how the world works. So let's take advantage of it. So ideologically neutral, science driven. I would say more slaves to the process I was trying to reveal than Reagan was. Reagan had, ideological commitments, and that was what drove him. For Skinner and Blair, for Clinton and Blair, was well, this is how the world works, so let's take advantage of it. And that's the point that I was trying to
It's
reveal
kind
with
of like
these.
everyone's a Friedmanite now, according to Clinton,
Exactly.
kind of like Nixon said everyone's a Keynesian now.
Everyone, yeah, and everyone somehow became a Milton Friedman type, where this is all there is, and I hope we'll talk a little bit more about his perverse influence on how we think
Yeah.
about ourselves later on.
Well,
In
yeah,
any event,
well,
the
we
book,
can go kind of go through the book and then come back. So the book comes out in 1986, 87, right?
yeah,
Battle for Human Nature. I read subsequent to reading the book, I went and found I think an LA Times review, which is a very positive review of the book. Did you have a sense when it came out that, let's say 3, 5, 8 years after writing it, it might have an impact, or how did you ever think about the impact it might have?
well, I was a kid. I started teaching at Swarthmore at the ripe old age of 25. So I was 35, incredibly naive. The first book I wrote was a textbook. So I had never operated in the waters of writing a book for a popular audience. And I had these ridiculously grandiose aspirations that people would, see the book and the scales would be removed from their eyes and the future of history would go in a different direction.
Right, right.
Needless to say, that did not happen. The book, as I like to joke, the book sold like 12 copies because my family has 12 people in it. Um, it was not, it got very nice reviews, but it was too theoretical, too
Yeah,
abstract.
yeah.
Um, didn't focus on here are the 10 things we need to do to create a more just society and a more fulfilling way for people to live. Uh, so the self-help industry hadn't started yet, but it was in people's minds, what can I get out of this book that can change my life tomorrow? Um, so, yeah, so it didn't have that impact. But I also want to emphasize I had no intention of writing a book. All I was trying to do was plan a course. And then I was invited to give a talk by a former student. And instead of talking about the lab research I had done in the past, I decided I would see if I could put together a talk on this topic, which is not your typical talk, right? Your typical talk is a set of experiments I've done to try to answer this narrow question. So I sat down and I started sort of outlining, writing what I might say. And when the dust settled, I had a 70-page manuscript, which obviously I can't do in an hour talk. And suddenly the light bulb went on. Maybe I can write a book about it.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
that was where the idea of writing a book germinated. And if I hadn't been invited to give that talk, it might never have happened. Anyway,
And then a number of years later, maybe 6 or 8 years later, you did try to write a book, The Costs of Living, that
yes,
got a little bit more practical,
yes,
about these ideas.
that's
Did
right.
that have any more uptake, that book?
That had even less uptake.
Less uptake, okay.
Uh, and, you know, so the thing about the battle for human nature is that it was really painted in very broad strokes. This is what economics says, this is what evolutionary biology says, this is what Skinner says, and here's what's wrong with all of them. Uh, in the costs of living, the point of that book was to suggest that when we let market thinking get too close to the things that matter most to us in life, if we start putting a price on friendship, if we start putting a price on loyalty, if we start putting a price on being an intercollegiate athlete at a college or university, it erodes what's good about those parts of our lives, and it turns everything into an extension of the market. And again, as I said to you a few minutes ago, the market has its place, but that place isn't every place. And when you make it every place, two bad things happen. One, things we value get corrupted so that they're not valuable anymore. Relations with other people. There's a dollar sign attached to them now, and that changes the relation. The second thing is that what people never realized is that the effectiveness of the market depends on people who do not apply market thinking to everything. You know, you don't take advantage of every opportunity. You don't lie and cheat your way to success. There are rules of conduct that people follow in their interactions with other people. So you don't need a state to control the market because you have basically decent people interacting with the aim of securing a profit out of the exchange. What happens when that decency gets eroded?
Mm,
Well, now it becomes a jungle. And now all of a sudden, you're always looking over your shoulder to make sure you're not being taken advantage of. And now the government needs to step in to prevent bad actors from exploiting innocent participants in the exchange. And all of a sudden, the incredible efficiency of the market goes away because it's not self enforcing anymore. And what Adam Smith didn't realize when he invented the market in 1776 is that it was it was parasitic on the kind of moral teachings that he took for granted in the England that he was writing about and in the 18th century. And if you corrode those moral teachings so that you create a kind of anything goes environment, all of a sudden, the incredible efficiency and power of the market starts to degenerate. So that was the point of that book. A, the things we value become less valuable because they get corrupted. And B, even the market stops working in the way we want it to because the constraints on our behavior have eroded. So
yeah,
that's why I wrote that book. I
yeah,
think it's the best book I've ever written, although I have written several since then, but it was it had a sad fate.
yeah. What's interesting is I came across your book in, I think, 2021 when I read it. It was 37 years old at the time, and it read like it could have been written that year.
I know.
And that's what really struck me about it was I was starting to do some research around the history of economics, going back to Adam Smith and looking at I was obviously fairly aware of, some psychological, dynamics, social psychology, sociology, and I was starting to pull these threads together, and here was a book 37 years ago that had done the same thing, and, what comes across as a reader all these years later is, "Hey, this is a clarion call that never got any brought any clarity, and so why is that?" And that's been a question that has animated me for years, which is how do we how do we begin to reintroduce that idea of the public good and that idea of having a government that can rein in some of these things, that can create a reality in which things can again be outside of the market? Not everything gets pulled into the market. But to a degree, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, we've been somewhat brainwashed, I believe, into this, as you say, flattening and mechanistic view of human nature. That's where it starts, because if we believe those things about human nature, then we can have all sorts of beliefs about how we should structure society, right? And in many ways, I think of it as, that old line, I think it was Marshall McLuhan that said, "I don't know who discovered water, but I'm sure it wasn't a fish." And that we're all fish in water, not realizing that the water has been somewhat poisoned a bit by a set of assumptions, quite literally on some negative externalities by pollution. The water has been polluted, but it has been polluted a bit, and we're swimming in it. And what a lot of us feel nowadays is that's the given. So now, how do I survive inside of water, some of which I realize the pollution, some of which I don't even realize has been polluted? And
Well, and that really was the reason I wrote these books. Um, there's an idea that comes from Karl Marx. Um, he talks about ideology, and he uses it not in the way we use it nowadays, which is a system of beliefs. For him, ideology meant, quote, false consciousness. We believe something to be true that isn't, and then we act as if it's true. And the particular ideology that bothered him was this notion that people work for pay and nothing else, and all that matters if you employ people is that you figure out how to pay them. What they do doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to them, and it doesn't matter to you. So you can make jobs as unrewarding as possible and make people completely interchangeable parts, just like the machines are, and they won't care as long as they get paid. So this is a false view of what
Mhm.
people care about, according to Marx. But what happens is if you build a factory system that embodies that view, so wherever you look, people are just cogs in a machine, the view stops being false. Because if that's the only work that's available to you, well, then damn it, yes, the only reason you take a job is for the paycheck because there's no other reason to take that job. And so what you've done is you've created a social structure that embodies these false assumptions. And over time, these false assumptions become true. So you get born into this and you ask, what's the point of life? What should I aspire to? And you look around and you say, well, work is just to get paid so I can get pleasure and satisfaction when I'm not working. I've just, resigned myself to having half my waking life be drudgery. And the question is, how can I make the other half of my waking life worthwhile? You
Yeah,
know? So
that
so it is deeply, deeply it is like not nothing you're in water. It's exactly what it is. And that was the point that I was trying to make,
yeah,
that if you can imagine another way of organizing work, then all of a sudden possibilities appear
yeah.
that you had not even contemplated.
And I think that the word I really wanna pick up on there is resignation. I think that, we talk about burnout, that's a big topic in corporate America. I think it's a big topic just in life right now, the speed of life,
Yep.
AI, obviously, on some levels, it's helping, but on many levels, that's just gonna become another, baseline that everything gets built on top of. Um, and, but the other side of resignation, if you can get past it, if you can see something as possibility, which is why I've named this podcast The Possibility of Business. One of the things I wonder if you have some thoughts on, and maybe you can plug in some of the theories you were talking, Milton Friedman and some of the history there. Um, when you think back to creative destruction was I'm
Hayek.
I know, but,
Schumpeter,
yeah,
sorry.
Schumpeter, right. Creative destruction. When I think about business and I think about the positive side of business, because business gets such a corporate American can get such a bad rap, and, the reason why I've chosen to make my life there is because I do believe in this creative power of business. When done well, with the right circumstances, it has the ability to create extraordinary things in a way that, what's the old expression? Capitalism is the worst form of organizing a society except for everyone else that's been tried. And, there are some inherent problems with capitalism. These, as you have pointed out in your books, these assumptions like that Marx brought up make their way in and ossify things. But at its core, there's a creative power and a dynamism in capitalism that has always been the promise. It has always been the attractive pull. And the question that swims in my mind all the time is how do we take that seed of possibility, that creative possibility, and create a world in which we keep our eyes on the things that cause it to ossify, the corporate capture, buying out government essentially to keep them off our back, the monopolistic stuff, the antitrust stuff that's price only. There's other things that should be considered in antitrust besides price. All these reasons why it kind of solidifies and ossifies and becomes this kind of resignation machine. But at the core of it is this creative machine. And so I wonder if you've thought anything about that tension that needs to be dynamically managed in society.
I would say I've thought about almost nothing else for the last 40 years, because I agree with you, that the evidence, it's foolish to deny that the world is much richer than it has ever been, and there are fewer people in poverty than there have ever been. And the prospects just look brighter all the time. So the engine of creativity and effectiveness that capitalism puts in place has been transformative. And you're right, no one's figured out another way to do it. But the way I think about it is this: it's a great system when the people who operate within it are good people. It is not a great system when the people who operate in it are amoral or immoral. And so capitalism is the way to produce incredible innovation and growth among people who have good character. But capitalism itself does not nurture good character. In
I love
fact,
that.
if
That's a
my
great
story
framing.
is right, it corrodes good character.
Mm,
And
mm.
nobody has been minding the store. Everybody has taken it for granted that you learn character, at the church you go to every Sunday or at your parents' knee or something. Character is not our problem. Character is other institutions' problem. And I think the worship in the US especially of freedom and the reluctance to impose values on other people has made it that what little bit of character instruction went on, say, in public school is now verboten. It's not your place to teach kids what's right and what's wrong. It's their parents' place. So all of a sudden, creating good character, creating good citizens is not part of the agenda of public education. And I think its main claim to fame and celebration and support was that it was meant to create good citizens. And,
Yeah.
people weren't ashamed of that. People weren't embarrassed. People weren't wary of saying, well, this is the right way to behave. We don't do this. And so the worship of freedom and not imposing your values on other people, and a society that got more and more pluralistic. So it became harder to impose your values on other people because we didn't share the same values, all of us, essentially made sent the nurturing of character went AWOL. And now you've got this incredibly powerful institution, the market, with nothing about it that nurtures and insists upon only people of good character can play in it.
And in fact, economists would advocate and have, and I don't know if it's been updated, but that it is inherently values free. That's why it works.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. And here we come back to Milton Friedman. So what I think was incredibly destructive and really won the day was Milton Friedman's argument that as somebody who runs a company, you have one responsibility, and the responsibility is to enrich your investors. You can make a lot of money and then use that money for social justice, to promote education, to help immigrants, whatever the hell you want. But using your business to do any of those things is a fiduciary violation. So you make as much money as you can. Whatever damage you do is just a side effect. And then you use your profits to undo some of that damage. And, this was the ideology. And it was bad enough when you ran your own business and you didn't have to answer to anyone. But when you go public and you have shareholders, then you do have to answer to people. And, there's a cost to worrying about being a good capitalist. There's a cost to worrying about caring about the environment, about caring about the retirement of your workforce, caring about the quality of work experience that your employees have. Nothing should be should be adopted that compromises the possibility of profit.
Yeah. It
And even if people didn't completely follow that, it was what was whispering in their ears. And so instead of making major commitments to creating workplaces that people valued and that served the community, they might just sand off the rough edges of the ruthlessness of the business, because they couldn't live with themselves otherwise. But the focus was clearly on maximizing return on investment. That's your job.
a
And that has become, I would say, the official ideology of particularly American capitalism. I think in Europe, which is also democratic, there is an understanding that the state has responsibilities to citizens, that there are many things that people need and care about, healthcare, education, that it's the state's responsibility to provide. And therefore, the state can regulate what companies do and tax citizens in order to provide these public goods. And people who value freedom just as much in Norway as they do here, nonetheless, are willing to pursue their individual tastes and values within the constraints of a system that makes demands on them. In the US, we don't make demands on people. It's every person for himself. And then, of course, if that's the case, how much money do you need so that you can afford to send your kid to Harvard? Well, no matter how much you have, it may not be enough.
right. There's a
You know,
scorecard. Eh,
there is a scorecard. In Canada, universities are ridiculously cheap. In Europe, universities are ridiculously cheap. Only in the United States is it a six-figure annual expenditure to send your kid to an elite university.
you've touched on, I think, what is a really big idea here, which is this foundational element of, call it, morality, civic awareness, character. And you made a great point a few weeks back when we connected, which was the Wealth of Nations, written by Adam Smith, which has been largely considered a Bible of capitalism, was his second book. His first book was Theory of Moral Sentiments, written about, I don't know, 30 or 40 years earlier. And that one of the big things he picks up on, I think it's picked up in Wealth of Nations too, is this idea of natural sympathies. This idea that we have these natural desire to support each other and act as good citizens. And he built the market, his market ideas on that. And I think you had a great line, which was, it turns out those sympathies weren't as natural as we had thought. Eh,
That's exactly my point. Yes, people have these sympathies, but they aren't natural.
yeah,
They're cultivated, they're nurtured, they're hammered into people.
yeah,
And when you neglect the institutions that do the nurturing and the hammering in, well, all of a sudden those natural sympathies start to dissipate and degrade. And then you've got a war of all against all, which is what Hobbes said societies were,
right,
you
right.
know.
And now you've
So
got right. Now you have this proof that Hobbesian was right, and this is where we get into this cycle of
that's right. Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely. And right now, it's interesting. I'll put my politics out there. We're threat we are now under threat that a 250-year-old experiment, which has mostly been successful, is on its last legs, and I'm referring to the government of the United States. And people are discovering, my, what a surprise, that the Constitution isn't specific enough. It offers guidelines, but mostly the reason it works is that there are strong social norms. There are certain things you just don't do. And in the last 10 years, we have discovered that there are people who don't abide by those norms, and they will do absolutely anything. And when people like that ascend to positions of power and influence, you come to realize what a slender reed the Constitution is. Just as the market depends on decent people or people who are willing to obey social norms, so too American constitutional democracy depends on decent people or people who are willing to obey certain social norms. And when those norms get shattered, all bets are off. And the sad fact is that what takes decades or generations to build can be destroyed in an instant.
yeah,
That's another thing we're learning. And it's not like when the current gangsters in power leave office, we'll snap our fingers and everything will go back to the way they were. It's a generation long project at best to rebuild those social norms and take them seriously and reconstruct the institutions of government that have come to violate those norms. It's not going to happen overnight, and it takes incredible attention paying and effort on the part of citizens to hold people's feet to the fire and make sure that this project of reconstruction continues once we have the opportunity to begin it. So I think that the very thing that Adam Smith failed to appreciate, the neglect of social norms, uh, we have also failed to appreciate when it comes to running a democratic society. Uh, it's only when they're violated. Fish don't know they live in water until the water dries up.
right,
Then they know.
yeah,
We don't know we live in a society of social norms until the norms get destroyed. Then we know.
yeah. And what do you, as you think about impacting it? Obviously, as your point of view, I think, is one that a lot of people would share, which was it takes time. It's going to take, if some of these things can be turned around, if this is seen as a wake up call. I think a very charitable way of looking at our current situation was before some of the things we're dealing with right now, we had some creeping problems. We had a lot of creeping problems. Democracy is always just an experiment trying to be perfected. It is inherently messy. As soon as democracy doesn't become messy, it becomes authoritarianism. And so it almost has to be messy. Um, and this is, in many people's estimation, a bigger mess that we've created now. And some people might say, "It's a wake-up call. It's an opportunity to hit reset." Um, and if you were to think about, given all the thinking you've done over the years on these topics, some of those spots where the dig in on the wake up call would make the biggest impact, whether it's education. I happen to believe there is a role for business and business leaders to play in it. But I wonder if you have thoughts on some of the places to seed some of those new insights and realities.
Mhm. Well, I do think that putting the onus on government to rebuild itself is almost certainly not going to work. You need the right raw materials. Where do those raw materials come from? I think it is crucially important for us as a society to recommit ourselves to the value of truth telling. And there are several places where we count on people to be truth tellers. One of them is the academy. It's all about discovering and then sharing the truth about whatever it is. And do people make mistakes? Of course they make mistakes. The truth is always provisional. Science, as I like to say, it's the history of science is the history of one damn mistake after another. But what was mostly true is that scientists were committed to finding the truth, even if they weren't always successful at doing it. And I think what's happened as the market has gotten too close to science is that being successful has become more important than being truthful. You need grants, you want tenure, you want a salary boost, you want a job offer, and you make compromises in your pursuit of the truth. And so the university, the school as an institution that embodies the value of truth has really been undermined. So we need to rebuild the university as a paragon of truth seeking. The same is true of journalism. There are standards of journalism. To be a journalist, real card-carrying journalist, you have to adhere to certain standards of truth-finding and truth-telling. But when your focus is on getting eyeballs, and that has to be your focus because you won't be able to pay people's salaries, all of a sudden, there are corners that get cut, and you worry less about whether it's true because you worry a little bit more about whether people will be interested in it. And so you've got less confidence in journalism. And it doesn't help when people in positions of power and authority almost every day undermine journalism by suggesting that any truth they don't like is fake news, you know? So here are two institutions that we depend on that are mere shadows of their former selves. And I think rebuilding the state structure without rebuilding institutions like that will be a very hard job.
Great
So,
distinction. Yeah.
so you need, and also think the same thing is true of business. We have to pretend that no, it never existed and ask ourselves as business leaders who our stakeholders are and not just who our shareholders are. And it needs to be legitimate for you to conduct a business with an eye on stakeholders. You know, um, I think all of that is possible, but first, the people have to have the scales lifted
Yeah.
and appreciate the importance of doing their part in their private lives to re-energize and re-strengthen the institutions that we depend on because none of them are functioning in the way we need them to function.
Yeah. And as you think about I know that you're thinking about rewriting a version of The Battle for Human Nature, or maybe more specifically, The Cost of Living.
Yes.
And as you think about doing a retrospective 40 years, or, 32, 3 years later for The Cost of Living, looking back and updating, what are some of the things you're interested and eager to explore in that next version?
Well, you were very kind when you said that when you encountered this stuff, you thought that I had been prescient because it seemed like a very accurate description of the world we currently live in, not the world we were living in 40 years ago. My own sense is that that's very kind of you, but actually, the world we live in now is substantially worse than the one we lived in when I wrote the book, because all of the processes that I worried about and wrote about and wrung my hands about have only gotten worse. I could not have imagined. I'm a big sports fan, so I had a whole chapter about sports. I could not have imagined in 1994 what sports would be like in 2026. The complete abandonment of amateurism, uh, where college athletes in major sports are just hired guns, and some of them don't leave college because turning pro would constitute a pay cut. They're making more more money as amateur athletes at Berkeley or Alabama or wherever than they would as rookies in the NBA or the NFL. What? It's preposterous, you know? And people, the athletes are always looking to the highest bidder. So you're basically, hired help as an athlete. And at the end of the season, you cast around to see if you can get a better deal somewhere else. And I don't want to just blame the athletes. The institutions are making millions and millions of dollars on the visible sports. And what's true at the amateur level is obviously true at the professional level. It's hard to figure out why anyone is a fan of a particular team in the pros when the personnel on those teams a- are gone the next day. you know, what is the team? Isn't the team the players? Well, it can't be the players because the players I love aren't on the team anymore. So what are you supposed to do? So there's no loyalty on the part of players toward the team or the team toward the players, and uh, and so it's become a much worse version of what I wrote about than it was in 1994. The same exact thing is true of healthcare. I was just reading an article about how venture capital has started investing in nursing homes. Now they find this to be a very profitable area of investment, and the question is why? And the answer is because they find ways to run them more efficiently. And then the question is how? And the answer is that they lay people off right and left so that the people who live in these nursing homes get much worse care. And there have been efforts to estimate how many more people have died than would have died if the nursing homes had been in the hands that they had previously been in. And it's tens of thousands of extra deaths
Yeah,
is the price that we're paying for the takeover of nursing homes by private capital.
yeah,
So the healthcare system has also gotten worse. Uh, Lawyers as hired guns has also gotten worse. It's hard to find a place, and as I mentioned, journalism and academic life have gotten worse. It's hard to find an area in society where the problems that drove me crazy in 1994 haven't gotten worse. So if people had read my book and decided, this is my mission, I I know this sounds remarkably self-aggrandizing, and my tongue is very far in my cheek. If only people had read my book, we would be living in paradise now.
and, I think that what's interesting is I think a lot of different people in different ways have tried to sound the alarm bells in the ensuing years. But as you mentioned, we've been given the permission to, be financially selfish because that is, we were sold. I mean, I think the one of the ultimate, um uh, I guess you could call it sleights of hand, has been that somehow a society of selfish people ladders up to public good and social, right? I mean, that has been, I think, one of the most brilliant sleights of hand that the kind of, let's say, free market economists have been able to pull off. Um, and so I can go in having grown up with a morally very strong upbringing from family and from friends and from my community. And I can be in the work world for 3 to 5 years and have some of that stuff get turned around.
Yep.
Not because I'm necessarily antisocial or have grown up in that world, but because I'm told that's how you have to survive, right?
Oh, no, that's the only message you get.
And that's,
Um,
yeah,
and, there are in business schools, I spent 5 years after I retired at Swarthmore teaching at the Berkeley Business School, which is a wonderful place. Um, in business schools, that's sort of what you get taught. They have ethics courses. But my interpretation of the ethics courses is that they're really law courses.
right.
That is to say, this is what you can go to jail for. It's not about this is the right thing to do.
And even
And
that line is moving.
even that line is moving. So, I have a one-sentence ethics course that I tried to foist on my students at the business school at Berkeley. Said it's a simple question you ask yourself before you make a decision. And the question is, would I tell my children? And if the answer to that question is no, don't do it. Eh,
Yeah.
and it doesn't have to do with your legal culpability. It has to do with, can you look at yourself in the mirror? There's a wonderful play, I don't know if you know it, by Arthur Miller, who wrote Death of a Salesman. It's called All My Sons, and it's a just an extraordinary play, and it's about a guy who makes aircraft during World War II, makes components of aircraft, and he scrimps on a particular part in order because he's under enormous pressure and he needs to make a profit and support his family. And it turns out that it could have been innocuous, but it turns out there are a whole bunch of plane crashes and people die. And they don't know who's responsible, but he knows who's responsible. And one of his sons discovers that he did this deliberately. And all of a sudden, he can't even bear the thought that he is the son of a man who would send kids to their deaths. And one of the people who died, one of the pilots who died, is this man's other son. So he's doing what he thinks he has to do to run his business. And he puts blinders on about the ethical consequences of operating in that way. And when it comes out, it ruins his life, ruins his son's life, and it kills one of his sons. So that, it seems to me, is if he woke up every morning and said to himself, "Would I tell my kids?" This would not have happened.
Yeah. That's a good, very simple measuring stick. And one of the things that crosses my mind a lot is that old Timothy Leary line of, go out and find the others. And I think in our society, one of the things we're having a hard time doing is finding the others. Meaning, you and I are having this conversation. There are, I think, it's probably a bell curve out there. There are people on the short end of the close end of the bell who maybe they're even psychopathic in nature. What I'm interested in is really not other people, nothing moral, and I just want. We've Society has had them forever, right? That they've been here forever. Then you've got the people at the far end of the bell who are truly not only aware of this moral crisis, but they're vocal about it and they're really trying to have an impact. And then you've got, I think, this big section in the middle of the bell, which kind of say something is wrong. I don't like it. I don't know how to put my finger on it. And at the end of the day, I know that if I just show up at this job and I do what I need to do, I can walk away and keep my family safe. And that's what I'll do. But if the tide started to change some, they would be on board with it because not only some of them are actually aware of it and they get a sense they're not crossing over any illegal lines, but they get a sense that they are uh, operating in a moral gray area. And then there are people who actually don't know because they've just been in that water for so long. But if their eyes were open, they would actually be pretty willing participants in a more moral agenda. I think there's some opportunity, and I think it's got to start with people in power. As you've said, there's people in power in the government have a very, let's call it, muted sense of power nowadays. Um, and, I think our business leaders have an opportunity, some of the people on the far end of that bell, to be the others, to get the voice out. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this podcast, and it's called The Possibility of Business, not the actuality of business, because that would be a very depressing podcast in my mind. Um, but the possibility of business is to get more of those full-throated leaders out there, the Yvon Chouinards of the world. I know Patagonia is held up as an enormous example. It's not a public company, it's a private company. That makes it a bit easier. But get more and more of those. And I wonder if you've had thoughts through the years as you've done this writing on how to galvanize people to be that power to build more of a wave of emergence of this moral awareness and clarity.
So the answer is I have thought about it, but clearly I don't know how to do it because, the books I've written that we've been talking about were an effort to make that happen in my modest way. So I don't know how to light the spark. But I think the implicit model of social change that you just articulated is the right one. People ask themselves when the Soviet Union collapsed, how could that have happened overnight? When everybody in Russia seemed to support the Soviet Union. And the argument that was made, I think, quite persuasively, is that you had um, the vast majority of the country going along to get along. They had deep reservations about the way the state was run, but they kept these reservations to themselves. And they might have been willing to speak out if there were other people speaking out. So who's the first person to speak out? Somebody who just says, well, if I die, I die, speaks out. And that makes it a little easier for the next person who's not quite as courageous as the first to speak out. And that makes it a little easier for the next person. So what you've got is an undercurrent of deep dissatisfaction with the state, but an unwillingness of anyone to make it public. And then when a few people decide, we can't take this anymore, it makes it easier for other people who have the same thoughts to go public with them. So I think this is a model where you can produce rapid change because the seeds of change are there, but people are unwilling to be public about them. And I think probably the way this happens is you get a handful of very courageous people in positions of power and authority who speak out. This is not what business is for. This is not what government is for. This is not what academic work is for. They speak out and they make it a little bit easier for other people who share the same sentiment to speak out. Yale, I just read this in today's Times, Yale authorized a committee of faculty to take a hard look at Yale and other academic institutions, because if Yale's got problems, you can be sure that other places do too. And they just came out with a report that is really an indictment of how Yale has neglected the essential aspect of uh, its being and allowed this kind of diminishment of respect for for academic institutions to grow in the larger society. It took its position for granted. It didn't It didn't preserve the things that made its position, justified, and all of a sudden, it lost that position. It didn't happen overnight, but it felt like it happened overnight because no one was paying attention. And now what you need is to reverse this process by getting people to pay attention. And I know there are a lot of faculty members who basically go along to get along and feel deeply uneasy about the shape their institution has taken in recent years, but they don't have either the courage or the time to go public. But once a few people go public, others may follow. There's a historian named Timothy Snyder who has become a huge public figure because he wrote a book on freedom and a book on tyranny, prompted by the Trump administration. And all of a sudden, so he is a beat of courage and expertise, and he takes every opportunity to speak publicly. And that makes it easier for people who are not in as privileged a position as he is, as a very distinguished historian, to take the leap and become public intellectuals, not just private academic intellectuals. And all you can do is, do everything you can to support the courageous few and hope that what will happen is that the courageous few will become the less need to be courageous many.
Yeah. That's
So I think there's some reason for optimism if you have this kind of model of change, which is that everyone's dissatisfied and just waiting for somebody to get them over the edge and turn them into public people.
it's a collective, it's a collective endeavor and
Yep.
in the social change model you lay out. I think that's a great way to end the conversation. I look forward to staying in touch and seeing as you, continue work on this next iteration of the book, and maybe if you get a copy done in the next, year or 2, we can chat again. Uh,
That'd be lovely. I'm so thrilled that you discovered this ancient book and thought it was valuable enough to connect with me. And this has been a fabulous conversation.
Thank you.
Also makes me feel like I'm 35 again.
That's great. Yeah. Well, thank you. Appreciate your time.
Same here.
Okay.
Thank you.